it's been a good week over here. We've seen some noteworthy improvement in interest rates, continued improvement off the week jobs report last week, and into good inflation numbers this week. So, good news for us, right? But good news in our space is typically indicative of bad news elsewhere. Most are now saying that the writing is on the wall for a recession that history books will note started in Q4 of 2023. Now, that's right now. The recession indicators range from consumer debt, which is now up to 1.1 trillion, but sadly the most noteworthy part of that information is that delinquencies are rising. Earning expectations for the retail industry, even ahead of the holiday season, are declining, and credit is tightening while banks cut back on staff to lean out. In 7 out of 10 sectors, the forecast on earnings is down, and equities markets watch those earning expectations very closely. I get the impression too that Americans are feeling all of this, not just in the casual conversations that I'm having with them, but in the data that shows 8.4 million Americans have taken on second jobs. That's a record high. And this is just my opinion, but I don't think that you make the personal sacrifice that comes with taking on a second job on top of your full time job um, just so you can have more luxuries in life. I think you take on a second job on top of your full time job, additional stress and time away from your family. I think you only do that in order to make ends meet, in order to survive. A former Fed chair said this week that he predicts a rate cut from the Fed on the federal funds rate will come in the summer of 2024. And I spoke to a couple local smarties this week who echoed the same thoughts. They agreed, in their words, that no way, no how is the current administration letting us go into an election unless the economy is doing better. So they will cut interest rates. If we look at history, the first rate cut the Fed does typically comes 10 months after their last rate hike, which would be May of next year. So that could get us feeling optimistic, but we've been here before, guys, and been fooled. So my only caution is we can't rely on history. I've made this point here before, and you guys know where I'm going with this. We've never been on the other side of a period of time like this one, where the Fed was so involved for so long in stimulating our economy. This is why we might have ruined an entire generation, maybe two. It was historical patterns that led us to believe that we would see lower interest rates last summer, that we would actually be in the fives before the end of this year. And where did that get us? Where did following those historical cycles get us? Well, for me personally, a lot of public humiliation. I'm just kidding. I know you guys weren't making fun of me or talking snarky shit behind my back. Okay, where was I? So, I've also read that health insurance is going to curb our inflation progress very soon. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to change how it measures healthcare costs, but you won't, like it doesn't take you or I being an economic expert to know that health insurance is at the level of extortion that we see with appraisals. So if those numbers are coming in to the CPI with a new measuring tactic, that could really increase inflation because we know those costs are inflated. So this might be why Goldman Sachs is the lone wolf predicting that we won't see any rate cuts until this time next year. Now, what's happening locally? At times like this, when things feel really up in the air, I think the really smart folks, the wise ones, get hyper local with their data so they can make strategic decisions for themselves. Last weekend, all 3 offers I worked with borrowers on were in multiple offer situations. We were dealing together with their realtor on positioning ourselves to be the best offer at hand rather than asking for any sort of seller concession. So I'm feeling the 18,000th shift of this year in the market. And I'm wondering if you guys are too. I'm also wondering what investors are doing because I spoke to another local smarty who was telling me that she's struggling to rent her single family units. And I would have thought that the buyers who got priced out of the market to buy a home this year by interest rates would want to rent a home, a single family residence. But the apartment buildings, especially the luxury ones in town, are offering 2 months rent. And so she with her mom and pop investors can't compete with the first 2 months of rent being free. We know that millennials and Gen Z don't view money the same way as other generations. But I'm honestly still scratching my head at if they don't realize that after the first 2 months free, that astronomical rent is going to be due each and every month on that tiny apartment. Fannie Mae reports that vacancies are at 6.5%. And if you're not familiar with the data on how those usually run, 6.5% is pretty high for vacancies. And then what's happening on a global level? Many of you know that my brother Arjun lives in the Bay Area. Lots of San Franciscans were displeased by Biden's visit this week, not because of their political affiliation, but because the city cleaned up the streets. For the first time in I think like 5 years, they picked up the trash, displaced the displaced, and put out planters. Literally planters. I'm not kidding, guys. I have eyes on the ground. He's a witness there. And he talks to me on his way to work every day. And in the spots where he usually sees humans defecating in public, there were planters put in those same spots. I bring this up because Biden was in San Francisco to meet with the Chinese president. China is in a recession. China is in a deflationary period. China affects us. Watching them may help predict what's coming next for us, except for with housing. China's housing market is in really bad shape right now. I don't see any data or mathematical information that would show our real estate market is going to follow a similar path. And they're not always tied, right? Like when we had our great housing crash, they did not. So don't freak out. I know what I say here is of great importance to you guys, and I don't want to be keeping anyone up tonight worrying. Would deflation be so bad though? Well, after so much focus on the war against inflation, you might think that deflation is the goal, but it's actually a risk. If we have a fairly mild recession, it will be okay and just bring inflation down into the zero neighborhood. That's great. If inflation readings go negative because the landing isn't so soft, then we have a problem. If the cost of goods and services goes down too much, company profits go down. And we care about those guys at the top because when they're not feeling good about profits, they lay off people down below. So you can see how if a recession leads to deflation that leads to more unemployment, that's kind of a vicious cycle. Plus, we know how to tackle inflation. We are living through that exercise right now as the Fed pulls the one lever it has to mitigate any problem in the economy: raise the Fed funds rate. When you have the opposite problem, deflation, what can they do? The Fed funds rate can't go negative, so they don't have any lever to pull, and that's why it's a much harder problem to solve. It hasn't happened in America since the Great Depression. So what are we going to watch? My best advice to survive this market is to just grow thicker skin. I'm kind of kidding. Kind of. My advice was actually to watch for the specific interest rate you need to see in order to qualify for the monthly payment in the price range you need to buy in. I cannot put together a tale of a housing crash right now, even if I use my wildest imagination. And if you know me, you know I have a pretty wild imagination. I can craft out pretty worst case scenarios in very good detail. It's just not on the horizon for real estate. So don't get your sights set on a recession that's going to bring you a home on clearance. And don't let your buyers believe that narrative either. Set their sights on the rate they need in order to afford the home they need. Maybe not the home they want, but the home they need. Because I think that rate may be coming sooner than we thought. And that's going to be their moment to capitalize. That's going to be their moment to have timed the market and won. And if you tell anyone that I told anyone to time the market, I will deny it. Have a great weekend, guys.